Greetings and welcome back to CMST245 with Rebecca McCarthy at South Seattle Community College. This is part 2 in our podcast series on anti-institutional politics in our textbook, Rhetoric Online, the Politics of New Media. So let me pick up where I left off, this whole idea of cyber terrorists. Now, cyber terrorists as a term or as a concept is a rather new term and concept that was developed in the late 1990s. And it was in response to many digital aggressions against the government and also military institutions. And the authors had given a few examples of these military attacks on earlier pages. Now, what's interesting about this idea of the creation of cyber terrorism or a cyber terrorism group is the suggestion that they are some kind of homogenous unitary group that basically wants to take down the United States government. In a sense, by creating the term cyber terrorism, we are creating a common enemy in the rhetoric of a common enemy. And this is an observation that Kenneth Burke made in the rhetoric of Hitler, actually. So this is a normal form of propaganda, and we use to rhetorically create this so-called group of people in order to be able to take action and defend against it. Through the various documents that the authors have looked at, we understand that the classification of cyber terrorism includes hackers, crackers, hacktivists, and other individuals who basically are challenging status quo institutions by using technology and the internet. And we are giving two definitions here, one by Joshua Green and the other one by Denning. Joshua Green explains that cyber terrorism actually merges two spheres, that is terrorism and technology. However, it is Denning's definition that the authors focus on. Cyber terrorism is the convergence of cyberspace and terrorism. It refers to unlawful attacks and threats of attacks against computers, networks, and the information stored therein when done to intimidate or coerce a government or its people in furtherance or political or social objectives. Furthermore, to qualify for cyber terrorism, attacks should result in violence against persons or property, or at least cause enough harm to generate fear. Attacks that lead to death or bodily injury, explosions, or severe economic loss would be examples. Serious attacks against critical infrastructures could be acts of cyber terrorism, depending upon their impact. Attacks that disrupt non-essential services or that are mainly costly nuisance would not. So what the authors are trying to point out is not all hacks are acts of cyber terrorism, certainly not by the definition that we are given by Denning. Many hacks just cause a nuisance, maybe it's a costly nuisance, or maybe it is even an embarrassment to a certain person, such as their example of hacking of Sarah Palin's mail account, Yahoo account. Certainly, the hack itself is a form of hacktivism, but it is not a form of cyber terrorism. And so we need to find and be able to locate the distinction, not only the actual distinction, but the rhetorical distinction between these different forms of protest. The authors end this section by offering two other examples of hacktivism that was actually constituted as cyber terrorism. But it's important within these two examples to be able to see where the distinction is being made between political hacktivism and an actual cyber terrorism. With this section, it's also very interesting to see how those who are involved in undesirable protests can easily be painted as a common enemy that the rest of the public must actually be weary of. And we see this in all the examples they give, but we see this best in the WikiLeaks example of Julian Assange, and I may be pronouncing his last name incorrectly, but the owner or the person who controls WikiLeaks, and how he has been painted or was painted as a high-tech terrorist, and certainly went after as if he was himself a terrorist, rather than somebody who just ran a website that allowed other people to post information. So it's interesting to see how counterpublics, and this is a good example, can then be turned into the common enemy as well. The authors want to discover why hacktivism is often thought of as a form of cyber terrorism when, as the examples in the past pages have shown, obviously they are not always one and the same thing. Although there is no one event, the authors say, that gives us a reason for this making the two things one, they do, however, say that it is related to the aesthetic features of the web itself, the relationship of military technologies to web-based protest, and the collaborative narrative about both computer hackers and terrorists in American popular and governmental cultures. So basically, they look to where this idea has originated, hacktivism as being cyber terrorism. And they look specifically to Paul Varero and some of his work regarding speed and aesthetics. You might find this section a bit dense, and indeed it is a little bit dense. But the idea of speed and aesthetics kind of go back to what they were talking about when they discussed how counterculture groups often uses antagonism in order to create a form of unease or the feeling of fluctuation so that we can have an opportunity for reinvention of how things are done. So it is important for radical politics to use antagonism in order to create a type of chaos. And indeed, this is what speed does. Now, Paul Varero, he links the idea of speed in our modern time and how the speed of technology kind of leaves us in a state of fluctuation. So in his actual research, he talks about how speed and the logic of acceleration is at the heart of the organization and the transformation of the modern world. Varero explains his interest in speed. History progresses at the speed of its weapon system. And if you look on page 131, Herbert Dreyfus is quoted by our authors. And I think that this quote actually is part and parcel the key to what they're trying to get at in this very dense section. Web surfers embrace proliferation information as a contribution to a new life form of life in which surprise and wonder are more important than meaning and usefulness. Speed, if you will, and also acceleration actually creates surprise and wonder. And it also leaves us unbalanced, which can be a tool in which we can use for antagonism. That's just a side note. The rest of the quote reads, "This approach appeals especially to those who like the idea of rejecting hierarchy and authority and don't have to worry about the practical problem of finding information." So one of the things that hacktivists use in order to create this idea of antagonism and uncertainty is the speed and aesthetics that is now part of our current times and technology. Indeed, we often create technology way before we have any idea the consequences of that use of technology. We kind of just go with the flow, and this also creates a form of disorientation. The next few sections regarding why and how hacktivists are often confused with cyber terrorists are pretty self-explanatory. The discussion regarding military technology being used against the military is one self-explanatory heading, and I don't think you'll have as much problems with these sections. Analogous narratives is also a wonderful section, and that should be fairly easy to get through as well. So that brings me to a rhetorical theory of digital activism, a key to this particular chapter. Toward the end of this chapter, the authors give us yet a third definition of activism, and this one is by Tim Jordan. And Tim Jordan offers two categories that is important for activism. First, accessing and spreading censored or restricted information, and two, hacking or blocking information in an effort to make a political statement. Now, both of these categories are part of what is now called the hacker's ethic, which stresses the individual rights to engage in any and all information and technology for political, scientific, technological, public, or personal reasons. The authors want us to avoid trying to apply the same rules that we may use in order to look at old social movements when we're looking at hacktivism and digital activism, because they argue that this form of protest has more in common with economic and political institutions than with social movements today that is often concerned with identity recognition and local action. Some of the main things that make political activism, digital activism different is that they're very concerned about private information. They use aliases. They want to keep secret. And they want to make sure that they are able to disappear when they can. They don't necessarily socialize with other like-minded hacktivists. That is, that there is no major public place in which there is a meet and greet, but rather these individuals often meet during the event or the act of protest and then maybe never meet again. And indeed, most of the time, nobody knows whose identity is actually who, which is the whole point between the anonymous group itself. So when taking the time to analyze hacktivists and hacktivism, we have to be concerned about three main characteristics that is not found in most traditional counterpublics. One, they are exclusive and elusive. Generally, they are exclusive because you have to, not everybody can become a hacktivist. You have to have the knowledge in order to create the hack. They are also very exclusive in the sense that only certain people can do this. There is a speed of the appearance and disappearance of their protest actions, and also it is very difficult to interact with other groups. As such, a trail to the acts that one uses for protests are very difficult to uncover because there is generally a tendency to hide or to erase the tracks of authorship and participation. So because of these three aspects, when we look at digital protest, we have to approach it differently. And that kind of concludes my podcast for this particular chapter. I hope you found it helpful, and I look forward to talking to you more about all these issues and ideas on the discussion boards. Until then, goodbye.